guys, it's Grace, and today I'm going to be filming my 2018 reading wrap-up. I haven't made a video in a long time, so long time no see, hello. In total, I read 8,689 pages, over 21 books, and since I haven't made wrap-up videos regularly throughout the year, I thought it'd be fun to just go through the list of books that I read this year and just talk briefly about them, talk about my ratings, and just make a quick little video. But without further ado, we're just gonna jump right on in and get started talking about the books I read in 2018. I started off the year right with Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. This book was so good. It's the second book after Lady Midnight and is a part of the Dark Artifices. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. It was so amazing. I'm not going to talk too much about the plot of this one because I feel like everyone already knows, and also this is the second book in the series, so that would be kind of spoilery to talk about. I love this book and I'm so excited to read Queen of Air and Darkness. The next book I read in 2018 is Artemis by Andy Weir. I read The Martian like 2 or 3 years ago and absolutely loved it. The humor in it is just the same as The Martian. It's so good. It follows our main character Jazz, who's trying to survive in this colony, and she does that by being a criminal, essentially. I just zipped through this book. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, just because I remember being not entirely engrossed in the story right away, but it was really good, and if you liked The Martian, I highly recommend checking this book out. The next book I read was Crank by Ellen Hopkins, which is a book of poetry that is about drugs. One specific drug. I don't remember what crank is. Is it cocaine? I'm not well versed in drugs. It was a quick read. It was all, you know, poetry, so it was very quick to get through, even though it is a little bit of a chunker. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars just because I got kind of bored and it started feeling a little bit repetitive after a while. And I was definitely happy to give this one a try. The next book I read this year was actually a little bit different than the books I usually read. Usually I'm reading more fiction than anything else, and the next book is not fiction. It is Note to Self by Connor Franta. I read this book in a time that it really impacted me, and I really needed a book like this. I have heard really good things about it, so I picked it up and I bookmarked the heck out of it. Like, each one of these bookmarks is something in this book that really stood out to me and I felt was important. Talking about his personal struggles and just some of the real things that no one ever talks about was just really important to me, and I really enjoyed this book a lot. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, and I know for a fact that I will be rereading this in the future, and I have opened up to my bookmarked pages on the days that I just need a little pick-me-up or motivation. Next up, I have Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I have been hearing amazing things about this whole trilogy for ever, and I haven't picked it up yet until this year. It felt a little overhyped as I was reading it, but I did really enjoy this, and I remember really enjoying it a lot. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I liked the world building, the plot. It was all really interesting. I couldn't get super into it at this time though, and I feel like that's how it was with a lot of the books I was reading this year, just because I wasn't in the best reading mindset. A lot of these books, if I went back and reread them, I would enjoy them more. Then the next book I read was Golden Sun, also by Pierce Brown, which is the second book, and I enjoyed this one a little bit less. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I feel like I always get that way with the second book in series, just because it just feels like, oh, the first book everything happened, and then the second book they always take a step back and they're like, okay, and then it's just more plot building and less action, which is good to have the plot building, but sometimes it just kind of takes the momentum away from the story, I feel like, and sometimes I'm like, do we really need this book? I did enjoy it, I just couldn't get quite as into it. It took me almost 2 months to read this book. And next up, I have my annual reread of A Court of Thorns and Roses. I gave A Court of Thorns and Roses and A Court of Mist and Fury, which I don't have with me. So I read these two again and of course gave them a 5 out of 5 stars because I just love to reminisce with these books. After those two, I read Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, and I loved this book. I loved this book. It was a fantastic time. I really enjoyed it. I watched the movie right after it, so I had those two things to compare it to. And honestly, I was really impressed with the movie too. I'm sure you all have heard the premise of it by now, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But if you're looking for a really cute, fun read, I would highly recommend this one. It was really good. I give it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Did I not read this book? I thought I did. I'm really confused because I could have sworn I read Morningstar, but it's not on my list. Now I feel like I have to reread it. I'll just read the last page. Wait, what? What? Maybe I didn't read this. I'm so confused. What? Now that I just spoiled myself for this book. I can't believe I didn't read this. Well, I guess I'm gonna read this now. Like right now. I can't believe I did that. Moving on! I reread A Court of Wings and Ruin. Go figure. Gave it a 5 out of 5. Once again, go figure. Not gonna talk about this because I've already read it. Next up, I read A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. Let me tell you a little bit about this book. This book is just a bridge story between these 3 books that are already out and the companion series that is coming out next. But even for a bridge story, I enjoyed it immensely. I'm not really a huge fan of filler stories, bridge stories, story compilations, any of that, because I feel like they're just pointless. And in a way, this kind of felt like the same thing, like, just take us to the next one. Nothing happened in this book that couldn't be summed up in like a couple pages of the next book. But I still enjoyed it immensely because I love Rhys and Farah with all of my heart, and all of the other characters in this series, so I still gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, just because I would literally read about them eating breakfast and going to the mall and doing like super mundane, boring things just because I love these characters so much. Next up, I read a contemporary, Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins. I enjoyed this book a lot, and it was definitely one of those guilty pleasure reads that you just really enjoyed reading because it's a cute, fun contemporary novel. But I will say that there were parts of this book that I disagreed with. There is a relationship in here that is so cute and I love them together, but one of the characters in the relationship has a girlfriend, so it is basically cheating, and I do not appreciate that at all. So for that reason alone, I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was another reread, and that was Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. I read this book 2 years ago. I enjoyed it so much more the second time I read it. I like books, so I wasn't a huge fan of the format of this, and also I just couldn't get behind the characters. They didn't feel like they had any depth, or like the plot didn't feel like it was going anywhere. But I went to London this past year and I ended up getting to see Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. That made me appreciate this so much more because I could envision the characters so much better, and they just felt like they had so much more depth after having been given an actual character. With books, you get descriptions, you get their inner thoughts, you get like all of this stuff. This, you don't get that. It's just explaining what happens in the play. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 this time, and definitely enjoyed it a lot more than last time. The next book I read is some more poetry, and it is To Make Monsters Out of Girls by Amanda Lovelace. I've read other poetry by Amanda Lovelace and absolutely loved it, so I had to pick this one up when I saw it at Target. I gave this one a 5 out of 5 stars. I think her poetry is just so deep and it just opens your eyes to so much. I highly recommend any of her books of poetry if you're interested in getting started reading some poetry. Next up, we have a trilogy that has to be added to my all-time favorites. So first of all, we have A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. Like I said, I went to London this year, and these books have been sitting on my shelf for a while, and I figured they take place in London, so maybe this is a perfect time to give them a shot. And I'm so happy I did, and I can't wait to reread them. They're one of those books that you just finish them and you want to start reading them again immediately after you finish them. This book takes place in a world where there are multiple Londons. So there's Red London, White London, Grey London, and Black London. And there are these characters called Antari, and they can travel in between the different versions of London. Our main character is named Kel, and he travels to the different Londons and is kind of a messenger and keeps the peace between the different Londons and just connects everything. And then he meets up with this very awesome character named Lila, who is just the sassiest lassie I have ever met in a book, and I just love her. So long story short, they end up like trekking around and going on this adventure, and that's all I'm gonna tell you. Good, I gave this one a 5 out of 5 stars. Then we have A Gathering of Shadows, which is the second book, also a 5 out of 5 stars, and A Conjuring of Light, which I also gave a 5 out of 5 stars. This series is 100% on my favorite series of all times list. Next up, I read a little bit of a spooky one because this is around Halloween, and that is There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins. I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it, but once again, I just couldn't get quite as into this one as I was hoping. Kind of a murder mystery story that takes place at a high school. People keep getting murdered and they're trying to figure out who done it, and it's really good. That's all you really need to know. And I'm glad I read it around Halloween because it just made it like 10 times better. Next up, I have another book of poetry, The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one, also by Amanda Lovelace. This is the companion to The Princess Saves Herself in this one, which came out last year or maybe the year before. And it was another just super empowering book talking about the struggles of being a woman and what we have to do in order to stand up for ourselves. I didn't like this one quite as much as the first one, so I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I have two very exciting ones that I'm sure you all will be thrilled that I'm finally getting around to. So the first one is The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas. So this is a bind-up of stories that take place in the Throne of Glass world. For those of you who know me and my opinions on bind-ups, you probably know that I usually don't like them. I really enjoyed this one, to be honest. I was surprised, and I was debating just not reading it since I don't usually like bind-ups, but I'm really glad I did because I felt like it gave me a good stepping stool to get into Throne of Glass, because I read that you should read this one first, even though it came out like 4th or something like that. So I'm glad I read that and took that into account and gave this one a try. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And then next up, the one I just finished today is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I have been putting off this series for so long. Now I'm finally starting this series, and now it looks like I'm gonna have to take a little bit of a break because I apparently never finished Morningstar, and I feel like I have to finish that. I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. It was a little slow paced during some parts. I was just like wanting more action. I was also reading it like over finals. Like I had to take a break about halfway through the book because that was when finals fell. So I think that might be a little bit of the reason why I couldn't get as into it as I hoped. I did read like the second half of the book in one sitting just now and enjoyed that second half so much more. As a whole, I loved this book. It was really good, and if you're one of those crazy people like me who still hasn't gotten around to reading this series, I highly recommend picking it up. So anyway, that is it for my 2018 reading wrap-up. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you get notified whenever I upload a new video. I'll see you next time. Bye!